Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we dive into tonight's story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. That way, you won't miss any of our bedtime stories filled with real-life moments and unforgettable experiences. Now, let's begin. It was the middle of July 1987 when Brooklyn felt like a furnace. The air shimmered above the cracked sidewalks of Flatbush Avenue, and the sweet smell of roasting peanuts drifted from the vendors outside Prospect Park. The sun had already begun its slow descent, yet the heat lingered stubbornly, pressing down on the neighborhood like an invisible weight. That afternoon, a group of friends had gathered at a worn-out baseball field near McCarran Park. The diamond wasn't much. Its bases were chipped white stones, and the outfield grass grew uneven, full of dandelions and patches of dirt. Still, for the boys who grew up in the neighborhood, it was the only place that mattered when summer rolled around. Among them was Michael O'Connor, a 17-year-old with freckled skin and a mop of red hair that curled wildly beneath his cap. His best friend, Anthony Tony Russo, stood tall at the pitcher's mound, his arm loose but steady. They had been rivals and teammates since childhood, their games watched by the same small circle of families and neighbors who leaned against a chain-link fence, sipping from sweating bottles of soda. By 4 o'clock, the field was alive. Shouts of encouragement mixed with the metallic crack of the bat and the thud of gloves catching balls. Children chased foul balls into the street, while older men lounged on folding chairs, trading stories about their own youth. From a nearby apartment window, someone played Bruce Springsteen on a radio, the sound floating into the air, blending with laughter and the rhythm of the game. On the makeshift scoreboard, the teams were tied. Michael's side, the so-called Brooklyn boys, was up against a neighboring crew from Queens who had crossed the bridge just for this match. It wasn't just any summer game. It was a matter of pride, the kind of rivalry that carried more weight than the fading white chalk on the field. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet, tension grew. Tony stepped on the mound, the dusty earth crunching beneath his sneakers. He narrowed his eyes at Michael, who now gripped the bat with both hands, his knuckles whitening. Everyone knew this was the moment, the pitch that would decide the bragging rights of the entire summer. The crowd hushed, even the smallest children falling silent. Michael adjusted his stance, the bat hovering just above his shoulder. Sweat slid down his temple, though whether it was from the heat or the pressure, no one could quite tell. Tony raised his arm, paused for just a heartbeat, then released the ball in a perfect, spinning arc. Michael swung. The crack echoed like a gunshot across the park, sending birds scattering from a nearby tree. The ball soared, climbing higher and higher until it seemed it might never come down. For a second, time stretched. Everyone tilted their heads back, eyes tracking the white speck against the twilight sky. Then it landed, but not in the field. The ball crashed through the open window of a brownstone across the street, shattering glass and sending a wave of gasps through the crowd. A silence followed, heavy and stunned. Michael dropped the bat. Tony froze mid-step. Even the radio seemed to quiet, as though the neighborhood itself held its breath. And then, the silence after the glass shattered seemed to stretch endlessly. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sound of the ball crashing to the window echoed in their ears, hanging in the humid Brooklyn evening like a shadow nobody could escape. Michael stood frozen near home plate, his hands still trembling from the swing. Tony lowered his glove, his eyes darting nervously toward the brownstone. Parents and neighbors, who had only moments ago been cheering and laughing, now leaned forward with wide eyes, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, from the broken window, a voice erupted. It was deep, angry, and sharp enough to slice through the heavy air. Who the hell threw that ball? The shout carried across the field, making the younger kids stumble backward in fear. A man's face appeared at the shattered frame. He was older, probably in his 50s, with a bald head that caught the last glint of the setting sun. His jaw clenched as he leaned out, glass still glittering around him. Michael's stomach twisted. He knew the house belonged to Mr. Kowalski, a retired dock worker who had lived in the neighborhood longer than most of them had been alive. He was infamous among the kids for his temper. Stories about him ranged from chasing teenagers off his stoop with a broom to yelling at delivery boys for leaving bicycles on the sidewalk. The idea that Michael had just sent a baseball flying into his living room made his knees weak. "Run," one of the smaller kids whispered, but no one moved. The game, the pride, the rivalry, everything had stopped. All eyes turned to Michael, the one who had swung the bat. Before anyone could decide what to do, the old man's front door burst open. Mr. Kowalski stormed out, his heavy boots pounding against the steps. In his hand, he held the baseball, its leather now marked with dust and a tiny streak of glass powder. He gripped it tightly as he marched toward the field, his face red with anger. Tony muttered under his breath, "Mike, you're dead." Michael's heart pounded. He wanted to explain, to shout that it was an accident, but his mouth felt dry. The neighborhood fell silent again, all of them watching the scene unfold. Even the teenagers from Queens, who had been trash-talking and laughing just minutes ago, now stood with uneasy expressions. When Kowalski reached the edge of the chain-link fence, he stopped. He looked at Michael, then at the bat still lying in the dirt. His eyes narrowed. For a second, it seemed like he might shout again or worse. Instead, he tossed the ball to the ground and let it roll to a stop near Michael's sneakers. "You kids think this is funny?" he growled, his accent thick and heavy from years of Polish roots. "That's my house. My wife's favorite window. Do you know what kind of trouble you just caused?" Michael swallowed hard. His voice cracked as he tried to answer. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean—" Kowalski interrupted sharply, his tone biting. He stepped closer to the fence, his eyes never leaving Michael's. The crowd around them remained hushed, as though they were all holding their breath, waiting to see what punishment might fall. Then, unexpectedly, Kowalski sighed. His shoulders dropped just slightly, and some of the fury drained from his expression. He looked at the group of kids, their sweat-soaked shirts and dirt-streaked faces, the anxious parents hovering nearby, and the neighbors with folded arms. Finally, his gaze returned to Michael. "You've got a strong swing, boy," he muttered, almost grudgingly. "But if you're going to play like that, you need to learn control. Otherwise, you're going to hurt somebody." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through them. Michael blinked, stunned that Kowalski hadn't called the police or demanded money right there on the spot. The old man shook his head and turned back toward his house, muttering under his breath. Before he disappeared inside, though, he called over his shoulder, "I expect someone to fix that window. Tomorrow." And then he was gone. The relief that swept through the field was immediate, but it didn't erase the tension. Michael bent down and picked up the baseball, staring at the scuff marks. Tony approached him, clapping him on the shoulder with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Man, you almost killed the whole game. But hey, that was one hell of a hit." Some of the Queen's kids laughed nervously, shaking their heads. One of them, a tall boy named Reggie, smirked and said, "Guess Brooklyn swings to the houses, huh?" The comment drew a few chuckles, but the air still felt heavy. The game had been interrupted in a way no one expected, and though the rivalry wasn't officially decided, everyone knew they would remember this afternoon for years. The sun had nearly vanished, leaving the park bathed in the dusky glow of twilight. Parents began calling their children, telling them it was time to head home. Folding chairs were packed up, soda bottles thrown into trash bins, and the radio was switched off mid-song. Still, the story of the broken window spread quickly, whispered from one group to another. Michael lingered by the fence long after most people had left. He couldn't shake the image of Kowalski's face, the sound of glass shattering, or the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He turned the ball over in his hands again and again, as though searching for an answer written on its surface. Tony joined him, leaning against the fence. "You know," he said casually, "it's not the first time someone's broken a window around here, but it's the first time the whole neighborhood saw it happen in the middle of a game like that. People won't forget it." Michael nodded slowly. He already knew Tony was right. The summer of 1987 would forever be remembered not for who won or lost, but for the swing that sent a baseball flying into Mr. Kowalski's house. As the night deepened, the two friends finally began walking home, the sounds of the city rising around them. Cars honking, distant music, conversations drifting out of open windows. Brooklyn never truly slept, and neither did its stories. And though the game had ended that day, something else had just begun. Michael couldn't yet imagine how that single swing would ripple through the weeks to come, how the broken window would become a legend told at block parties, how Kowalski's reaction would surprise everyone again, and how the neighborhood itself would be drawn together in ways none of them expected. The summer wasn't over. In fact, for Michael and the others, it was only just beginning. The night after the game, Michael lay awake in his small bedroom on the second floor of his family's row house on East Fifth Street. The room was hot, the fan by his window doing little more than stirring the heavy summer air. He kept rolling the baseball in his hand, the same one that had shattered Mr. Kowalski's window just hours before. Its scuffed marks caught the moonlight. Each scratch reminded him of the moment when everything had gone still. Downstairs, he could hear the faint voices of his parents. His mother, Ellen, spoke in a worried tone, while his father, Patrick, responded with a calmness that carried the weight of someone who had lived through worse. They both knew about the broken window already. Word in Brooklyn traveled faster than a subway train. A neighbor had seen the whole thing and had stopped by just after dinner to share the story. By the time Michael had come home, his parents were waiting at the kitchen table, their faces serious. His mother had put her hands on her hips. "Do you realize what you've done, Michael? Mr. Kowalski has never liked kids playing near his place, and now you've given him the best excuse to come after you." Patrick had leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a thoughtful expression on his face. "The boy's got a swing, Ellen. I saw him play before. Strong arms, steady eyes. Maybe this will turn into something more than trouble." That night, though, neither reassurance nor scolding could quiet the storm in Michael's chest. He thought about Kowalski's words, about control, about learning how to handle strength. The old man's anger had been real, but underneath it, Michael had caught something else. Maybe respect, maybe disappointment. He wasn't sure. By morning, the news had spread even farther. On his way to the corner store to buy milk, Michael overheard two older women gossiping outside a laundromat. "Did you hear about the Russo boys game yesterday?" Ball went straight through Kowalski's window, nearly scared the old man to death. At the deli, a man in line chuckled as he told another customer, "That kid's got power. Shame he can't aim." Michael lowered his cap and hurried out, the weight of the stairs heavy on his back. It wasn't that people were angry. Most seemed amused, as though it was just another neighborhood story to tell over coffee. But to him, it wasn't funny. It was a mistake, and one he felt responsible for fixing. That afternoon, he decided to do something most kids in the neighborhood would never dream of. He walked up the steps of Kowalski's brownstone and knocked on the door. The air smelled faintly of polish and old wood, and he could still see shards of glass glittering on the stoop. The door creaked open. Mr. Kowalski stood there in a white undershirt, suspenders hanging at his sides. His face was stern but not surprised. "I figured you'd show up," he said flatly. Michael swallowed hard. I wanted to say I'm sorry again, and I'll help pay for the window, or fix it myself, if you let me. Kowalski raised an eyebrow, studying the boy's trembling posture. After a long pause, he stepped aside. Come in. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn. On a small table sat a framed black and white photograph of a woman smiling, her hair pinned up in a style that spoke of another era. Beside it was an empty teacup and a newspaper folded neatly. The broken window had been covered with cardboard and tape, but tiny cracks of sunlight still pierced through, scattering beams across the rug. That was my wife's favorite window, Kowalski said, his voice quieter now. He glanced at the photo. She liked to sit here and watch the neighborhood go by. She's been gone 10 years, but I still keep her chair by the window. You can just break glass. Boy, you broke a memory. Michael's throat tightened. He wanted to apologize again, but the words felt too small. Instead, he nodded. Then I'll make it right, however I can. For the first time, something softened in the old man's face. He leaned back in his chair, studying Michael. You've got guts coming here alone. Most kids would have run. I'll tell you what, tomorrow, you meet me here at 10 in the morning. We'll fix that window together. The next day, Michael showed up as promised. Tony, who had caught wind of the plan, insisted on coming along, though he lingered awkwardly at the door while Michael stepped inside. Together, with Kowalski guiding them, they removed the broken frame, swept up the remaining shards, and fitted a new pane of glass. It took hours, the summer sun baking them through the open window, but by afternoon, the living room looked whole again. When it was done, Kowalski wiped his hands on a rag and gave a short nod. Good work. You learned something today. Not just about windows, about responsibility. Tony grinned, elbowing Michael on the way out. Guess you're not just a baseball player now. You're a handyman, too. But for Michael, it was more than that. Something had shifted. The broken window wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a turning point. Over the following weeks, the game became a story retold at nearly every stoop, corner, and block party. Kids exaggerated the details. Some claimed the ball had flown 3 streets over. Others swore Kowalski had chased Michael with a broom before forgiving him. No matter how it was told, the story always ended the same, with the reminder that it was a summer Brooklyn would never forget. Michael, meanwhile, found himself returning to Kowalski's house more often. At first, it was to make sure the window held, then to help with small chores the old man couldn't manage alone. Kowalski, though still gruff, began to share stories from his past, about working on the docks, about raising a family in Brooklyn during the hard years, about the games he played as a boy in Poland before the war. Sometimes, after a long afternoon, they would sit on the stoop together as the sun went down, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. Children laughed. Radios played. Cars honked in the distance. It was Brooklyn's heartbeat, steady and alive. Tony and the other kids teased Michael for spending so much time with the old man, but Michael didn't mind. He felt like he was learning something valuable, something no baseball game could teach him. Still, baseball remained at the center of his summer. The rivalry with the Queens kids hadn't ended, only paused. As August approached, talk of a rematch began to stir. This time, everyone agreed the stakes would be even higher. Pride was still on the line, but now the legend of the broken window hung over them too. Just don't hit it into Kowalski's place again. Tony joked one evening as they practiced behind the school. Michael smiled faintly, tightening his grip on the bat. He knew that the next game would carry more than just competition. It would carry the weight of everything he had learned since that day. Control, responsibility, the balance between strength and care. And though he didn't know it yet, the next game would bring another twist. One that would cement that summer of 1987 as a story Brooklyn would pass down long after the players had grown old. The weeks passed quickly, and by the time the first days of August arrived, the talk of a rematch had become impossible to ignore. The Queen's crew had been boasting loudly, telling anyone who would listen that the broken window game hadn't counted, that Brooklyn had been saved by a lucky swing and a piece of bad aim. Pride demanded a new contest. Flyers started showing up on telephone poles near McCarran Park, handwritten notes in blue ink that said simply, Queens versus Brooklyn, August 15th. Sunset. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than the ice cream truck on a hot afternoon. Mothers mentioned it at the butcher's. Teenagers swapped strategies at the corner store, and fathers promised to come watch after long shifts at work. It wasn't just another game anymore. It was an event. Michael felt the pressure growing with each day. He still remembered the sound of glass shattering, the heavy weight of responsibility in Kowalski's living room. But now, the neighborhood was looking to him again, not with scolding, but with expectation. His swing had become the talk of Flatbush Avenue. The older kids slapped him on the back when they passed, calling him slugger or window breaker. Even the little ones followed him around, asking if he'd hit another ball into the sky. On the evening of August 14th, the night before the rematch, Michael sat with Mr. Kowalski on the stoop of the brownstone. The air was thick and warm, carrying the faint hum of cicadas and the chatter of neighbors who lingered outside their homes. The repaired window glowed softly behind them, reflecting the streetlights. You ready for tomorrow? Kowalski asked, his deep voice slow and measured. I think so, Michael replied, though his hands twisted together nervously. Everyone's expecting me to do something big. What if I mess it up? The old man chuckled, shaking his head. Baseball isn't about hitting big every time. It's about knowing when to hold back and when to give it your all. Control, boy. That's what you need. Remember what I told you. Strength is nothing without control. Michael nodded. The words sank into him, heavy and steady. The next day, August 15th, the sun dipped toward the horizon, and McCarran Park came alive like never before. Families spread out blankets on the grass. Vendors set up coolers with soda and sandwiches, and teenagers leaned against bicycles, shouting bets on which side would win. The makeshift field looked the same as always. Bases marked by worn stones, an uneven outfield full of weeds. But tonight it felt like a stadium. By 6 o'clock, the teams had gathered. The Queen's boys wore matching gray shirts with Queen's Pride scribbled across the front in black marker. Brooklyn's crew, led by Tony and Michael, wore a ragtag mix of caps and T-shirts, their pride stitched not in fabric, but in their determination. The air buzzed with excitement. Radios played. Children ran barefoot along the edges of the field, and the smell of roasted peanuts drifted across the park. As the first pitch was thrown, the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The game was fierce from the start. Queens scored early, their tall hitter Reggie sending a line drive past Brooklyn's shortstop. Brooklyn answered with Tony's quick double, bringing the score even again. Every play drew roars from the crowd, and every call from the umpire, a volunteer father from the neighborhood, was met with both cheers and groans. By the time the sun had nearly set, streaks of purple and gold stretched across the sky. The scoreboard scratched into cardboard read 6-6. Once again, it came down to the final inning. Once again, Michael stood with the bat in his hands, sweat dripping down his forehead, his heart pounding in his chest. The crowd hushed, just as it had weeks before. This time, though, there was no fear of a broken window. This time, there was anticipation. Kowalski stood near the back of the crowd, arms crossed, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp on Michael. Tony called from the sideline, his voice steady. Take your time, Mike. Play it smart. Reggie from Queens wound up on the pitcher's mound, his arm coiled like a spring. The ball flew forward with speed, cutting through the evening air. Michael swung and missed. A gasp rose from the crowd. He adjusted his stance, teeth clenched. The second pitch came, lower and faster. Michael didn't chase it, letting it pass. Ball one. The umpire called. The crowd murmured, tension rising. The third pitch came. This time, Michael's bat connected with a sharp crack that echoed across the field. The ball shot forward, not high into the sky, but low and controlled, weaving between the infielders. The Brooklyn bench erupted as Michael sprinted toward first, his legs pumping with everything he had. The ball rolled past second base, into the outfield. The Queens player scrambled to catch it, but he stumbled on the uneven grass. The ball bounced away. Michael rounded first, then second. Tony waved him on from third, his voice breaking with excitement. By the time the Queens outfielder scooped up the ball, Michael was sliding into home plate, dust rising in a cloud around him. The umpire's hand shot out. Safe! The park exploded with cheers. Brooklyn had won. Children jumped up and down. Parents clapped. Teenagers whistled and shouted. Tony rushed forward, pulling Michael to his feet and wrapping him in a bear hug. You did it, Slugger. You did it. But Michael barely heard the noise. He turned his head and saw Kowalski in the crowd, the old man giving a small nod, just enough for Michael to understand. It wasn't about the win. It wasn't about the power of the swing. It was about control, about learning when to hit hard and when to play smart. That night, the neighborhood spilled into the streets in celebration. Radios blasted music. Kids played stickball under the glow of streetlights, and families shared food and laughter long into the night. The story of the rematch spread quickly, joining the tale of the broken window in the growing legend of that summer. As for Michael, he sat on the stoop with Tony and a few of the other players, sipping soda and catching his breath. His body ached. His clothes were streaked with dirt, but his heart felt lighter than ever. He knew this wasn't just a game. It was a summer when a broken window had turned into something unforgettable, when the neighborhood came together, and when he himself had learned the balance between strength and control. And though years later the details would blur in memory, whether the score had been 6-6 or 7-7, whether the ball had rolled between second and third or closer to shortstop, the essence of it remained. People still said, "Remember the summer game in Brooklyn, the one no one forgot?" They remembered the laughter, the tension, the shattering glass, and the comeback. They remembered the pride of their neighborhood and the way the park had come alive under the setting sun. For Michael, it was the beginning of many summers, but no other game ever felt quite like that one. The days after the rematch were unlike any other summer in Brooklyn. Every corner of the neighborhood seemed to buzz with retellings of the game. At the corner deli, old men who had barely glanced at the boys before now leaned over the counter to ask, "So, which one of you hit the winning run?" At the laundromat, mothers folded clothes and swapped versions of the story, each retelling making Michael's final slide into home plate more dramatic. By the time it reached the ears of people who hadn't even been there, some swore the ball had flown clear over the park fence, while others said Michael had slid straight through a cloud of dust so thick no one could see him until the umpire shouted safe. For Michael, the attention was overwhelming. On one hand, he loved it. For the first time in his life, his name carried weight in the neighborhood. Kids wanted to play with him, older boys respected him, and strangers called out, "Hey, Slugger," when he passed. But on the other hand, it was heavy. Every time someone repeated the story, he felt like he was carrying a responsibility not to let people down. Tony, of course, thrived on the attention. He had always been the louder one, the natural leader who cracked jokes even when things were tense. He retold the story with flair, his arms flailing as he described the slide, his voice rising at just the right moment. "I swear, The dust cloud was so big you could have hidden a car in it, he'd say, and people would laugh. But in the quieter hours, when the streets were still and the heat of the day gave way to the cool of night, Michael thought of Kowalski. The old man hadn't cheered, hadn't clapped, hadn't joined the celebration. He had just given that simple nod. Somehow, that meant more than the loudest cheer. A week after the game, Michael stopped by the brownstone again. The repaired window still gleamed, unbroken this time, the glass catching the afternoon sun. Kowalski was sitting on the stoop with a cup of tea, watching the street with his usual serious expression. "You played smart," Kowalski said without being asked. "That's what I wanted to see. Not just power. Control." Michael sat beside him. The stoop was warm from the sun, and the air smelled faintly of fresh bread from the bakery down the block. "I think I finally get what you meant," he admitted. "It wasn't just about hitting as hard as I could. It was about choosing the right swing." The old man gave a rare smile, small but real. "You'll find that lesson useful outside of baseball, too. In life. Sometimes you'll want to swing hard at everything. But sometimes the smarter move is to hold back, to wait, to be patient. That's what control really is." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the city sounds. A bus rumbled past. Children laughed in the distance, and somewhere a radio played a soft tune. As the summer edged toward September, the neighborhood began to change. School supplies appeared in shop windows. Parents reminded kids about bedtimes, and the endless freedom of summer slowly slipped away. But the legend of the summer game remained. Even the Queen's boys, who had returned to their side of the city, admitted grudgingly that Brooklyn had earned the win. Years passed. The boys grew older, their summers filled with new responsibilities. Michael took a part-time job at the hardware store on Flatbush Avenue, where he stocked shelves and carried lumber for customers. Tony started helping his uncle at the auto repair shop, his hands always smudged with grease. Their baseball games grew fewer, replaced by late-night talks about the future, about college, about dreams that stretched far beyond their block. But every now and then, when the weather was right and enough friends were free, they would gather at McCarran Park. The field was rougher now, the bases more worn, but the sound of the bat cracking against the ball still carried the same thrill. Children who had once chased foul balls were now players themselves, and they had heard the stories so many times that stepping onto that field felt like stepping into history. Remember when Mike broke Kowalski's window? They whisper, eyes wide. Remember the rematch? The legend had become larger than life. Kowalski, meanwhile, grew older and slower. His steps up the brownstone stairs became heavier, his hair thinner and grayer. But his bond with Michael never faded. Sometimes Michael helped him carry groceries. Other times he fixed things around the house. A loose hinge, a squeaky floorboard, a stuck drawer. And in return, Kowalski shared stories of his youth, tales of hardship and survival that painted a picture of a Brooklyn long before Michael's time. In the summer of 1992, 5 years after the broken window game, Michael stood on the same stoop with Kowalski. The old man's health had begun to fade, his hand shaking slightly as he lifted his teacup. The neighborhood had changed. New families moved in, old ones moved out, but the stories remained. "You know," Kowalski said, his voice thinner now but still firm, "they'll be telling that story long after you've left this block. It's not just about a game anymore. It's about the way a community came together, the way people remembered one another." Michael nodded. "I think about it a lot. How something so small, just a swing, turned into something so big." "That's how life works," Kowalski replied. "Sometimes the smallest moments carry the biggest weight. You'll see that more as you grow." By then, Michael was already making plans to leave Brooklyn for college. He had dreams of studying architecture, of building things that would last longer than a single summer. But he knew that no matter where he went, a part of him would always stay in that dusty field at McCarran Park. in that one unforgettable summer. Tony teased him about it, of course. You're going to be the only architect who designs stadiums just so kids can break windows, he laughed. But behind the joke was pride, and Michael felt it deeply. When the day came for Michael to leave for college, he stopped one last time at the brownstone. Kowalski was waiting on the stoop, as if he had known Michael would come. They didn't say much. Words seemed too small for the moment. Instead, Kowalski handed him a baseball. It was old, scuffed, the stitches frayed from years of use. "Keep it," the old man said. "To remember, not the mistake. The lesson." Michael carried that baseball with him for years, through college, through his first job, through the long nights when he doubted himself. It sat on his desk as a reminder of Brooklyn, of Tony, of Kowalski, of the summer game no one forgot. Decades later, when Michael returned to Brooklyn as a grown man, the neighborhood had changed again. New shops lined the streets, the park was cleaner, and the faces were different. But when he walked by McCarran Park, he saw children playing baseball, their laughter rising into the summer air, and he smiled. Somewhere in the cheers and the rhythm of the game, he could still hear the echo of that day in 1987, the shattering glass, the stunned silence, the roar of the crowd, and the simple nod of an old man who had taught him the meaning of control. And though time moved on, the story remained. Because in Brooklyn, on a hot summer afternoon, a baseball game had turned into a legend. The sound of breaking glass still echoed in everyone's ears as the baseball rolled across the wooden floor of the apartment inside the brownstone. For a few moments, no one moved, no one even dared to speak. Michael's heart pounded against his chest like a drum, his hands trembling as the bat slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the dirt. All eyes turned toward the building across the street, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, a figure appeared at the shattered window. It was Mrs. Henderson, a widow in her late 60s who was known around the neighborhood for her strict rules and sharp tongue. She leaned out the window, her silver hair frizzed wildly around her face, holding the baseball in her hand as if it were evidence of a crime. Her voice cut through the silence like a whip. "Which one of you hooligans thinks you can turn my window into your personal home run target?" No one answered. The kids along the fence shuffled nervously, and even the grown men on folding chairs avoided her gaze. Michael's stomach sank. He knew it was a swing that had sent the ball flying, but saying out loud felt impossible. His legs threatened to buckle as Mrs. Henderson's eyes scanned the group. Finally, Tony, still standing on the pitcher's mound, stepped forward. "It was an accident, Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "We didn't mean for it to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" she snapped. "Look at this glass. Who's going to pay for it? Certainly not me." She shook the baseball in the air, her rings catching the fading sunlight. The crowd buzzed nervously, neighbors whispering among themselves. Some muttered that the boys had gone too far this time. Others said it was just a game, and Mrs. Henderson should calm down. The tension thickened until even the air felt heavier. Michael finally found the courage to step forward. His face flushed red, his voice soft but steady. "It was my hit, Mrs. Henderson. I'm sorry. I'll fix it somehow." A ripple of surprise went through the group. Michael wasn't known for speaking up. He usually let Tony or the older boys handle confrontations. But in that moment, his honesty drew every eye to him. Mrs. Henderson squinted, her lips pressed tight. For a moment, Michael thought she might start yelling again. But instead, she sighed heavily and disappeared from the window. A few seconds later, the sound of her front door opening reached the street. She stepped out with the ball still in her hand, glass crunching faintly beneath her shoes as she crossed the street. The boys instinctively formed a line, as if bracing for judgment. Michael stood at the center, his heart hammering in his throat. When she reached him, she held out the ball. "You got a strong arm, kid," she said. her tone softer than before. But strength without responsibility breaks more than just windows. Michael took the ball, his fingers curling around it. I'll pay for the window. I can do odd jobs, maybe mow your lawn or... Mrs. Henderson cut him off with a wave of her hand. We'll talk about that later. Right now, you boys need to learn that this neighborhood isn't just a playground. People live here, and when you swing that bat, it affects more than just your game. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others chuckling about the drama. But for Michael and his friends, the game was over. The sun had slipped lower, casting long shadows across the field. The rivalry with the Queen's team had ended not with a victory, but with broken glass and an uneasy truce. As the boys gathered their things, Tony clapped Michael on the shoulder. You know, you really sent that one flying. If this was Yankee Stadium, they'd be cheering your name. Michael managed a small smile, though guilt still gnawed at him. Yeah, but at Yankee Stadium, nobody's grandma is losing a window. The two laughed, the tension breaking just a little. Yet as they walked home together, the weight of what had happened lingered in Michael's mind. Over the next few days, word spread across Brooklyn about the broken window. At the diner on Franklin Avenue, men sipped their coffee and shook their heads, joking that Michael had the kind of swing the Mets could use. At the corner store, Mrs. Henderson's name was whispered with sympathy and irritation in equal measure. The story grew in the retelling, until it was less about a broken window and more about the day Brooklyn baseball had made history in its own way. Michael kept his promise. He showed up at Mrs. Henderson's house the following Saturday with a broom, a bucket, and his sleeves rolled up. She didn't greet him with smiles or thanks, but she let him in, pointing to the mess he was expected to clean. For hours, he worked in silence, sweeping shards of glass, dusting and repairing what he could. At one point, Mrs. Henderson sat in her armchair, watching him with sharp but thoughtful eyes. Finally, she spoke. You know, my husband used to play baseball right here in this neighborhood. He wasn't much of a hitter, but he loved the game. Michael paused, leaning on the broom. Really? She nodded. He used to say baseball wasn't about winning or losing. It was about community, about bringing people together. Her gaze softened, though her voice remained firm. Don't forget that, boy. Michael carried those words with him long after he left her house that day. He told Tony, and soon the whole group knew. It changed the way they looked at their games. They still played hard, still fought for pride, but now they made sure to keep the field safer, to respect the people watching, to remember that every swing carried weight. By the time August rolled around, the story of that summer game had become a neighborhood legend. Parents teased their kids about breaking windows. Kids bragged about knowing the boy who could hit that far, and even Mrs. Henderson, though still stern, began attending the games with a folding chair, her sharp eyes watching every pitch and swing. For Michael, that summer became the turning point. He realized baseball wasn't just about personal glory. It was about connection, about the way a game could ripple through an entire community. And though he didn't know it yet, that realization would stay with him long after Brooklyn summers faded into memory. The night before the next big game, Michael lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above him. The noise of the city drifted through his window, the honk of distant cars, the hum of voices, the occasional bark of a dog. He thought about the crack of the bat, the stunned silence, the glass falling like rain. He thought about Mrs. Henderson's words, and about how quickly a moment could become a story that no one forgot. He promised himself he would play differently tomorrow. Not softer, not weaker, but with a respect for the power in his hands. And when morning came, the field once again filled with shouts, laughter, and the scent of peanuts from a vendor nearby. The rivalry with Queens wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. But this time, every swing carried a lesson. And in Brooklyn, under the blazing August sun, that lesson would be tested again. The August sun bore down on the field with the same unforgiving weight as it had in July. But there was something different in the air that day. The dust swirled lazily in the breeze. Children laughed from the sidelines, and the folding chairs along the fence were already occupied long before the first pitch was thrown. News traveled quickly in Brooklyn, and the neighborhood had caught wind that the Brooklyn boys were facing the Queens crew again. It wasn't just a rematch. It was redemption, a chance to rewrite the story that had ended weeks earlier with broken glass instead of cheers. Michael arrived early, bat slung over his shoulder, the memory of Mrs. Henderson's sharp voice still alive in his mind. He glanced across the street at her brownstone, its repaired window glinting in the morning light. She was there already, too, sitting in a chair near the fence with a tall glass of iced tea resting beside her. She didn't wave, but she gave the slightest nod when his eyes met hers. That was enough. Tony came jogging up, tossing a ball in his hand with his usual swagger. "You ready for round two?" he asked, grinning. Michael nodded, though his stomach fluttered with nerves. "Ready as I'll ever be." By 11 o'clock, both teams were assembled. The Queens boys were loud, slapping each other on the back, bragging about how this was their summer to dominate Brooklyn turf. Their captain, a lanky boy named Victor with a permanent smirk, pointed his bat toward the field like a general marking his territory. "Today," Victor announced, loud enough for both sides to hear, "we take Brooklyn down for good." The crowd groaned, some jeered, others laughed, but Michael kept his focus on the field. He wasn't there to impress anyone, not anymore. He was there to play with the responsibility Mrs. Henderson had reminded him of, and to prove to himself that the game could be more than just trouble. The game began with Tony on the mound. His pitches were sharper than ever, the ball slicing through the hot air with precision. The first Queens batter swung and missed twice before managing to hit a weak grounder that Michael scooped up easily at shortstop, throwing to first with practiced ease. The crowd cheered, and the energy pulsed through the air like electricity. But Queens fought back hard. Victor himself stepped up in the second inning, his eyes glinting with mischief. He connected on Tony's pitch and sent the ball deep into right field, driving 2 runs home. The Queens boys erupted in cheers, their voices echoing down the block. Brooklyn was behind, and Michael could feel the pressure building. When it was his turn at bat, the murmurs in the crowd quieted. Parents leaned forward in their chairs. Kids pressed against the fence. And even Mrs. Henderson set her glass down, her eyes sharp. Michael adjusted his cap, dug his cleats into the dirt, and tightened his grip on the bat. Victor, now pitching, wound up and released a fastball. Michael swung, but missed. The crowd groaned. The second pitch came, faster than the first, and again Michael missed. His teammates shouted encouragement, but doubt crept into his chest. He remembered the broken window, the silence, the way his stomach had dropped as the ball flew. He forced himself to breathe, to remember Mrs. Henderson's words. Community, responsibility, connection. The third pitch came, and this time Michael swung with control, not desperation. The bat connected solidly, sending the ball soaring high into left field. It didn't carry as far as his infamous home run, but it dropped neatly between 2 fielders, allowing him to sprint to second base. The crowd cheered, and Michael exhaled with relief. The game wore on, inning after inning, sweat soaking through shirts, dust clinging to skin. Every play was met with cheers or groans, every mistake magnified by the intensity of the rivalry. By the 7th inning, the score was tied. The sun had begun to dip, streaking the sky with pink and gold, but the energy hadn't waned. If anything, it had grown stronger, fueled by the knowledge that this game was about more than just baseball. Then came the final inning. 2 outs, runners on first and second, and Michael at the plate. The crowd held its breath. The entire neighborhood gathered into one collective silence. Even the radio in the nearby apartment seemed to pause, the notes of summer song hanging in the air. Victor smirked from the mound, winding up slowly as if savoring the moment. "Don't break another window, Brooklyn," he called, drawing laughter from his teammates. Michael ignored him, his eyes locked on the ball. The first pitch came, a curveball that dropped too low. He let it pass. The umpire, an old man from the neighborhood named Mr. Callahan, called it a ball. The second pitch came high and inside, forcing Michael to step back. Another ball. Victor's smirk faltered slightly. The third pitch came fast and true. Michael swung, connected with a sharp crack that sent the ball flying straight down the right field line. It stayed fair by inches, rolling deep into the corner as the crowd erupted in cheers. The runners flew around the bases, one crossing home plate, then another. Michael pushed himself, legs burning, sliding into third with a cloud of dust. Safe. The Brooklyn boys had taken the lead. The noise was deafening. Cheers, whistles, clapping hands, stomping feet. Michael looked up from the dirt to see his teammates rushing toward him, their faces glowing with triumph. Tony was the first to reach him, pulling him into a hug that nearly knocked him off his feet. "You did it, Mick," Tony shouted over the roar. "You won it for us." But Michael shook his head, breathless, dust streaking his face. "No," he said. "We all did." The final out came quickly after, Tony striking out the last Queens batter with a pitch that seemed fueled by the whole neighborhood's energy. The game was over. Brooklyn had won. As the crowd spilled onto the field, kids dancing, parents clapping, and neighbors congratulating one another, Michael glanced toward the fence. Mrs. Henderson was still seated, her lips curved into the faintest of smiles. She raised her glass of iced tea in a silent toast, then stood and walked back toward her brownstone. The legend of that summer game spread quickly, not just because Brooklyn had beaten Queens, but because it had united the neighborhood in a way no one had expected. From then on, whenever Michael passed Mrs. Henderson's house, she would nod at him, sometimes even calling out, "Keep it on the field, O'Connor." And for years afterward, people still talk about that game, not because of the score, but because of the way it brought everyone together, the kids, the parents, the neighbors who rarely spoke but found themselves cheering side by side. It became a memory stitched into the fabric of Brooklyn's long, hot summers. Yet for Michael, the story was far from over. Each time he picked up a bat, he felt the weight of that day, the responsibility and the possibility. He didn't know where baseball would take him, whether it was college, the minor leagues, or just more dusty field with friends. But he knew that no matter what, the lessons of that unforgettable summer would stay with him. The sun slipped below the horizon, painting the city in deep purples and golds. The field was empty now, except for the faint echoes of laughter and the scattered footprints in the dirt. Brooklyn settled into the hum of evening, the story of the game already becoming a piece of neighborhood folklore. And somewhere in his room that night, Michael lay awake again, listening to the city's heartbeat through his open window, knowing he'd become part of something that would never be forgotten. The next summer arrived sooner than anyone expected, though the boys of Brooklyn felt as if the year had been one long countdown. School dragged through the winter months, the streets frozen in gray, and the bats and gloves gathered dust in closets and under beds. But once the snow melted and the trees began to bloom, the talk on every corner circled back to baseball. Michael O'Connor was no longer the quiet boy who had once broken a brownstone window. That single hit, and the lesson that came with it, had shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand at the time. He had become a leader among the Brooklyn boys, someone the younger kids looked up to, someone the older neighbors recognized when they passed him on Flatbush Avenue. By June of 1988, the rematch between Brooklyn and Queens wasn't just a game. It was an event, Flyers were handwritten and posted on telephone poles. Parents planned picnics along the sidelines, and vendors promised to bring carts of lemonade and hot pretzels. Even the local barber, Mr. Caputo, told his customers he was closing the shop early that Saturday so he wouldn't miss a single pitch. That morning, Michael rose before dawn. The air was already heavy with humidity, the kind of summer heat that made the pavement sticky and the curtains cling to their windows. He pulled on his faded jersey, laced up his scuffed sneakers, and tucked his glove under his arm. His mother, a nurse who worked long shift at the hospital, stood in the kitchen sipping her coffee. "Big day?" she asked, a tired but proud smile crossing her face. "The biggest," Michael said, grabbing a slice of toast. She reached out, brushing a hand against his cheek. "Play hard, but remember, it's not just about the win." Her words echoed Mrs. Henderson's from a year before, and Michael nodded, feeling their weight settle into his chest. By mid-morning, the field near McCarran Park was alive. Folding chairs stretched along the chain-link fence, blankets were spread on the grass, and the smell of pretzels mixed with the sharp scent of sunscreen. Children darted about with sticks of chalk, scrawling names and numbers on the pavement, while older men debated last year's plays as if they were professional analysts. Mrs. Henderson arrived fashionably late, her straw hat tilted at a sharp angle, a paper fan flicking back and forth in her hand. She no longer carried the sternness she once wore like armor. Instead, she seemed amused by the whole affair, as though she had claimed partial ownership of the legend. She even allowed a small group of children to sit at her feet, listening as she recounted the story of the broken window, her voice exaggerated for dramatic effect. Michael felt the tension rising as the Queen's team strutted onto the field. Victor, still their captain, carried himself with the same cocky grin, though his shoulders had broadened and his swing had grown stronger. He scanned the crowd as if searching for recognition, then smirked when his eyes found Michael. "You ready to lose your crown, O'Connor?" Victor called, tossing his bat casually. Michael didn't rise to the bait. He only adjusted his cap and replied, "We'll see who's still standing at the end." The game began with energy that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Tony pitched the first inning with precision, his arm stronger from months of practice at the YMCA gym. The Queen's batters struggled, managing only a single hit before being shut down. The Brooklyn crowd roared, stomping their feet and chanting encouragement. When Michael came to bat in the second inning, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. His stance had improved, his swing sharper, but the pressure weighed on him. Victor threw a fastball that was past his chest, a statement pitch. The crowd booed, but Michael didn't flinch. He waited, studied, and when the next pitch came, a curveball dipping low, he connected. The ball sailed into left center field, bouncing off the dirt as two runners crossed the plate. The cheers were deafening. Children jumped up and down. Parents waved their arms, and Michael allowed himself a brief smile as he slid safely into second. But Queens wasn't about to be humiliated again. By the fifth inning, Victor hit a towering shot over center field, tying the game and sending the Queens fans into a frenzy. The rivalry was alive, every inning a tug-of-war, every play adding fuel to fire competition. The sun climbed higher, the heat oppressive. Sweat drenched the players, dust clung to their legs, and still the game pressed on. By the seventh inning, the score was locked again, tension simmering in every corner of the field. The boys played not just for themselves, but for the pride of their boroughs, for the stories that would be told in barbershops, diners, and corner stores for years to come. In the eighth inning, disaster nearly struck. Tony, exhausted from pitching, slipped on the mound and twisted his ankle. The crowd gasped as he limped off, supported by teammates. Brooklyn's chances seemed to waver, the Queen's boys sensing weakness. Michael felt the pressure heavier than ever. Without Tony, They needed something extraordinary to stay alive. The ninth inning arrived with the score still tied. The sun had begun to dip, painting the sky with streaks of orange and violet, just as it had the year before. The crowd leaned forward, voices hushed, as Michael stepped to the plate with 2 outs and runners on base. Victor sneered from the mound, his arm loose but deadly. History repeats itself, he called, loud enough for everyone to hear. Michael dug his cleats into the dirt, the bat resting lightly on his shoulder. He remembered the broken window, the lesson of community, his mother's words, and the hours of practice that had brought him here. The first pitch came fast, too fast. He let it pass. Ball 1. The second pitch followed, lower, biting at the corners. He swung and missed, the crowd groaning. The third pitch came, spinning toward him like fate itself. Michael swung, the crack echoing across the park. The ball soared high, climbing into the darkening sky, the crowd rising to its feet. It sailed past the outfielders, past the fence, and disappeared into the night beyond the park. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the crowd erupted, a thunder of cheers that shook the very ground. Michael rounded the bases, his teammates pouring from the dugout, the entire neighborhood spilling onto field in a wave of jubilation. Brooklyn had won again. The celebration lasted long into the evening. Neighbors shared food, children chased each other under the streetlights, and the players were carried on shoulders as if they were champions of the world. Mrs. Henderson, her voice hoarse from shouting, declared that she hadn't seen such excitement since the Dodgers had left Brooklyn decades earlier. For Michael, standing amid the chaos, sweat and dust clinging to his skin, the moment was overwhelming. He realized then that these games were more than rivalries. They were threads that wove the community together, binding generations with stories that would outlive them all. As night settled fully over Brooklyn, the boys sat on the curb, sharing bottles of soda and recounting every play, every swing, every cheer. Tony, his ankle wrapped in ice, grinned at Michael. You got something special. Mick, this isn't just summer ball anymore. You could go further, maybe even the minors, maybe more. Michael shook his head, though deep down he wondered. For now, it's about us, about Brooklyn. And as the city hummed around them, as laughter and stories carried into the night, Michael knew one thing with certainty. This was a summer baseball game in Brooklyn that no one would ever forget. The next afternoon brought a different kind of energy to the quiet streets around Prospect Park. The sky was clear, the kind of soft blue that stretched endlessly without a cloud in sight. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the tall sycamores that lined the neighborhood, carried with the faint sounds of the city, distant car horns, snippets of conversation, and the rhythmic squeak of bicycle wheels. In the middle of this calm, the baseball field was already stirring with life. Arthur arrived early, walking with his usual steady pace, his well-worn glove dangling from one hand. He liked arriving before the others, breathing in the stillness before the noise began. The bases were already set, the chalk lines bright against the reddish dirt, and he felt that familiar sense of anticipation rising in his chest. He had played in this park for years, yet each summer game carried its own charm, its own set of memories waiting to be made. By noon, the others started to arrive. Sean was first, as usual, with his bat slung over his shoulder and his grin wide enough to be heard before it was seen. He greeted Arthur with a playful punch on the arm, his voice booming across the field, as if he'd been storing energy all week just to unleash it here. Ready to win today, old man? Sean teased. Arthur smirked and adjusted his cap. We'll see who's limping home first. Not long after, Clara appeared with her younger brother, Marcus. Clara's curly hair bounced as she jogged toward the dugout, already pulling on her mitt. Marcus carried a bag of snacks instead of equipment, his contribution to the day being less about playing and more about keeping everyone fueled. Their arrival was followed by a wave of others. Henry with his cautious smile, Eli with his restless energy, and the twins, Peter and Paul, who were identical in looks but opposite in temperament. The atmosphere thickened with laughter, shouts, and the shuffle of feet on gravel. The dugouts filled with chatter, players trading jokes and stories about their week. Someone tossed a ball in the air, another stretch against the fence, and soon the rhythm of warm-up throws began. The leather popped against gloves in steady beats, echoing like a prelude to something larger. By 1 o'clock, the teams were set. It wasn't official, no league, no scoreboards, no uniforms. Just two groups of friends with enough passion to make the game feel as grand as any professional match. They split evenly, mixing skills and personalities, so that no side had too much of an edge. Eli took the pitcher's mound first, his wiry frame coiled with energy, while Arthur crouched behind the plate, glove open and eyes sharp. The first pitch flew fast and true, cutting through the warm air with a hiss. Sean swung hard and missed, the sound of the bat slicing nothing but wind. Laughter erupted from the sidelines, but Sean only grinned wider, tapping the bat on the dirt as if daring Eli to try again. The second pitch came slower, trickier, and this time Sean connected. The crack echoed through the park, sending the ball high into left field. Clara sprinted after it, her steps quick and precise, the sun glinting on her hair as she stretched to make the catch. She stumbled but held on, raising the ball triumphantly as cheers rose from her team. Sean tipped his cap in mock respect, retreating to the bench with exaggerated defeat. The innings rolled forward, each one filled with its own little dramas. Henry, quiet and reserved, surprised everyone with a sharp line drive that sailed past the infield, his modest smile betraying the pride he felt inside. Peter argued with Paul about strategy, their bickering so heated that neither noticed when the ball rolled past them, giving the opposing team a free base. Eli struck out twice, but made up for it with a diving stop at shortstop, dust flying as he threw to first just in time. The game swayed back and forth, the score shifting like the tide. By the fifth inning, both teams were tied, and the tension began to grow. The laughter was still there, but beneath it pulsed a deeper energy, the kind that made every swing, every throw, every sprint matter. The sun hung higher, pressing heat into the players' backs, sweat darkening their shirts. Yet no one slowed, driven by the rhythm of the game and the unspoken desire to be remembered for something in this moment. Then came the seventh inning, when something happened that none of them would forget. Arthur stepped up to bat, his eyes steady, his stance practiced from years of experience. Eli, still pitching, wound up with a determined look, eager to strike out the older man. The first pitch came in fast, brushing the edge of the strike zone, but Arthur let it pass. The second was slower, curving inward, and Arthur swung with perfect timing. The crack was louder than before, sharper, and the ball soared high above center field. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The ball climbed higher and higher until it disappeared into the glare of the sun. Everyone turned their heads upward, hands shielding their eyes, hearts pounding as they tracked as Aunt Clara sprinted backward, her glove stretched wide. But the ball sailed beyond the fence, landing with thud in the grass beyond. Silence hung for a heartbeat, then erupted into cheers. Even the opposing team clapped, the sound echoing off the trees. Arthur jogged the bases with calm dignity, his face breaking into a grin only as he rounded third and headed for home. It wasn't just a run. It was a moment that lifted the entire field, stitching itself into the memory of everyone present. But the game wasn't over. The sun dipped slightly, shadows lengthening across the field, and the competition only grew fiercer. Voices rose, hands clapped against knees, and the ball flew faster than ever. A sudden gust of wind swept through, carrying dust into the air and making every play feel urgent, as if the day itself wanted to hold on to their energy. By the ninth inning, the score was tied once more. Both teams leaned forward, every player alert, every movement charged with purpose. Parents and neighbors who had stopped to watch lingered at the edges of the field, drawn by the noise and the sheer joy radiating from the players. Children perched on the grass, wide-eyed, clutching half-eaten ice creams that melted under the sun. The final inning began with Sean at bat again, determination etched into his face. Eli, exhausted but unwilling to yield, delivered his pitch. The game, the day, the entire summer seemed to balance on what would happen next. And there, with the sun lowering and the shadows deepening, the moment stretched like a hell breath, everyone waiting to see which way the story would turn. Sean stood at the plate with his bat gripped firmly, his feet planted wide in the reddish dust. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, but his grin remained as steady as ever. He tapped the bat once against his cleats, then looked out at Eli on the mound. The air felt charged, as though the whole park was holding its breath. Even the children sitting cross-legged in the grass stopped fidgeting, their eyes locked on the unfolding moment. Eli wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. He had been pitching for most of the afternoon, his arm heavy, yet his determination had not wavered. He wound up slowly, deliberately, the ball cupped in his fingers like a secret he wasn't ready to let go of. The crowd noise dulled into a hush, broken only by the faint hum of cicadas in the trees beyond the outfield. The pitch came fast. Sean swung, the crack of the bat filling the field like a cannon shot. The ball rocketed toward right field, climbing higher with every heartbeat. Peter, stationed near the fence, sprinted backward, his arms pumping, his eyes locked on the small white blur cutting across the sky. The cheers began to rise, but then wavered as it became clear the ball might escape Peter's reach. He leapt at the last moment, glove extended, his body twisting in the air. The ball smacked into leather just as Peter hit the ground. For a heartbeat no one knew if it had stuck. Dust swirled around him as he rolled, and then he lifted his glove skyward. The ball secured inside. The field exploded with noise, a mixture of groans, cheers, and laughter. Sean threw his head back with a bark of laughter, pointing at Peter as he jogged back toward the bench. "You'll tell your grandchildren about that catch," Sean called. Peter only grinned, still brushing dirt from his knees, his chest heaving with both exhaustion and pride. The game pressed on. Each pitch, each swing carried the weight of the day. Marcus, who had spent most of the afternoon on the sidelines, suddenly asked to bat. He wasn't much of a player, more interested in the snacks he carried than the strategy of baseball, but the others cheered him on. They handed him a bat that looked slightly too big for his thin arms, and he stepped nervously into the batter's box. Arthur crouched behind the plate, his voice low and reassuring. "Just keep your eyes on the ball. Swing easy." Eli softened his pitch, giving Marcus a chance. The ball floated forward, and Marcus swung awkwardly. To everyone's surprise, the bat connected with a sharp crack, sending the ball skipping down the third base line. Marcus froze, staring at it in disbelief, until his sister Clara screamed, "Run!" The boy sprinted, his legs pumping furiously, his face twisted with effort. He made it to first base just as Paul scooped up the ball and hurled it across the diamond. The throw sailed wide, and Marcus was safe. The cheers from the sidelines rattled the air, and Marcus beamed with a mixture of shock and delight. For him, that single hit was as glorious as a home run. The innings stretched on, each play a new spark in the fire of memory. Clara followed her brother with a powerful hit that sent him racing to third. Henry stepped up and drove a ball deep into the outfield, bringing Marcus home the thunderous applause. The score tilted again, and with every run, the tension thickened. By the bottom of the ninth, the opposing team was down by 1. The sun had sunk lower, washing the field in golden light that cast long shadows from the players onto the dirt. The air smelled of grass and sweat, of dust kicked up by cleats pounding the infield. A small crowd had gathered by now, drawn by the sounds of laughter and cheers that echo beyond the park. Parents leaned on the fence, couples sat close on picnic blankets, and children squirmed on laps, all caught up in the rhythm of the game. Arthur stepped to the mound now, his glove snug on his hand, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He wasn't the fastest pitcher, nor the trickiest, but his experience gave him an edge. He steadied himself, lifted his leg, and sent the ball spinning toward the plate. The batter swung hard and connected, sending the ball skimming into the gap between second and third. Clara Dove, sliding across the dirt, her glove snapping shut around the ball. She scrambled to her knees, throwing to first in a single fluid motion. The crowd gasped as the runner crossed the base just a heartbeat too soon, safe by the slimmest margin. The next batter came, and the tension rose further. The crowd leaned forward as though pulled by invisible strings. The crack of another hit sent the ball into shallow center. Marcus, who had insisted on playing the outfield after his earlier success, ran forward with wide eyes. His small hands clutched at the glove, and somehow, almost by instinct, he caught it. The cheers were deafening, his sister sprinting over to hug him while the other players patted his back. But the runners still advanced. With 2 outs and bases loaded, the entire game came down to one final pitch. The sun was kissing the horizon now, the sky brushed with strokes of orange and purple. The cicadas' hum grew louder, mixing with the steady thrum of hearts beating across the field. Arthur wound up, every muscle tight with focus. He hurled the ball forward. The batter swung, the sharp sound of contact ringing out like a bell. The ball soared high, straight toward the left field fence. For a moment it seemed unstoppable, destined to vanish into the twilight sky. Eli, who had moved into left field after tire on the mound, sprinted backward with everything he had left. His legs churned, his breath ragged, his glove outstretched. The ball descended like a falling star. At the last possible moment, Eli leapt, his body stretched to its fullest, and the ball landed squarely in his glove. He stumbled, rolled across the dirt, and came up with the ball raised high. The inning was over. The game was won. The field erupted, both teams rushing to him, laughter and shouts mingling with the sudden ringing of church bells from a block away. Players collapsed onto grass, sweat-soaked and breathless, their smiles brighter than the fading sun. No one seemed to care who had technically won. What mattered was the way the game had unfolded, the way each moment had carved itself into their memories. Even those who had barely touched the ball felt as though they had been part of something bigger than themselves. As the sky darkened and the first stars pricked through the purple dusk, they lingered. Marcus passed around the last of his snacks. Clara teased Sean for striking out earlier, and Arthur leaned back against the fence, the smile on his face quiet but full. The city sounds returned, the honk of cars, the bark of a dog, the distant rumble of the subway. But within the field, time seemed to slow, as though reluctant to let go of the day. Somebody suggested returning next weekend, and the idea was met with cheers. No one wanted this to be the last time. They packed up their gloves and bats slowly, as if delaying the inevitable walk home. Yet even as the dust settled and the laughter faded into the night, they all knew the truth. This was the kind of game that would be remembered for years. When the game ended and the last cheers dissolved into the Brooklyn dusk, nobody wanted to leave. The field had gone quiet except for the chatter of the players as they lingered near the dugouts, reluctant to give in to the fading light. The cicadas had grown louder now, their steady hum a reminder that summer was still strong, and the smell of freshly cut grass mingled with the dust rising from the infield. Sean was the first to speak up after the final play had been replayed at least a dozen times in excited voices. He slapped Eli on the back so hard that the younger man stumbled forward. "That catch, are you kidding me? I thought that ball was gone forever." Eli, still catching his breath, smiled sheepishly. I thought so too. I just ran and hoped. Guess luck was on my side. Arthur leaned on the fence nearby, his chest still rising and falling with the remnants of the game. He said nothing at first, just watched the group with quiet pride. He had been playing for decades and could tell that what had happened that afternoon wasn't just another summer game. It had become one of those rare moments that stitched itself into the fabric of everyone's memory. Clara pulled Marcus close, ruffling his hair. The boy was still clutching his glove with both hands, his eyes wide with excitement. "You were amazing out there," she told him. "That catch in center field saved us." Marcus blushed, trying to hide his grin. "I almost dropped it," he admitted. "But you didn't," Arthur said gently. And that's what people will remember. By now, the light had thinned to a golden haze, stretching long shadows across the grass. Beyond the trees, the distant rumble of traffic blended with the sound of laughter. Families who had stopped to watch earlier were folding blankets and gathering children, but the players themselves seemed glued to the spot. No one wanted to walk away from the field just yet. Sean glanced around, his grin mischievous as always. "All right, who's hungry? I say we celebrate properly." The suggestion was met with cheers. It was tradition to wander down the street after games, usually toward the little diner tucked between a laundromat and a barber shop. Its neon sign flickered weakly even in daylight, but the burgers were good and the tables always big enough to fit them all. They gathered their things slowly. Gloves were shoved into bags, bats clattered together, and water bottles were drained until only air hissed out. Marcus carried the empty snack wrappers, proudly announcing that he had done his part both on and off the field. Clara laughed, slipping an arm around his shoulders as they walked out through the chain-link gate. The streets of Brooklyn were alive even as evening took hold. Storefronts glowed with warm light. Music spilled out from open windows, and the air was heavy with the scent of roasted peanuts from a vendor at the corner. They moved as a group, filling the sidewalk with their chatter. Every so often, one of them would reenact a moment from a game. Sean pretending to swing and miss, Peter holding an invisible ball aloft, Eli diving dramatically into an imaginary outfield. The laughter bounced off brick walls and lingered in the summer air. When they reached the diner, the place was buzzing but not crowded. The owner, Mrs. Kowalski, recognized them instantly. She had seen the group grow up over the years. First as children running wild with plastic bats, later as teenagers testing their limits, and now as adults still unwilling to let go of the joy that baseball brought. "Rough game or a good one?" she asked with a smile as they slid into the booths. "Best one yet," Arthur answered simply. Plates of food arrived, burgers stacked high, fries spilling over the edges, milkshakes thick enough to hold a spoon upright. The clatter of forks and the hum of conversation filled the diner. Marcus sat wedged between Clara and Eli, telling anyone who would listen about his hit, embellishing the story slightly each time until it sounded like he had nearly knocked the cover off the ball. No one corrected him. They were too busy enjoying the way his face lit up. Sean raised his glass of soda high. "To the game we'll never forget," he declared. Glasses clinked together, the sound ringing like a promise. The evening stretched on, the windows of the diner glowing brighter as the sky outside turned deep blue. At one point, Peter and Paul fell into another argument about strategy, whether Paul should have thrown to second base instead of first. But their bickering was met with good-natured groans from the rest of the table. Arthur, watching them with amusement, finally said, "What matters is that you were there. That's enough." As the plates emptied and the night wore on, the group began to talk about the future. Some had jobs that kept them busy during the week, others were studying, and a few were drifting between plans. Yet on that night, none of it seemed to matter. The only thing that felt real was the bond forged by the game, the simple joy of a summer afternoon shared together. When they finally left the diner, The streets were quieter. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light on the pavement, and the air was cooler, carrying with it the faint smell of rain that might come later. They stood outside for a while, not quite ready to part ways. Clara promised Marcus he could play again next time, and the boy's face lit up with anticipation. Sean stretched and yawned loudly, declaring that he would hit a home run in the next game no matter what. Arthur looked up at the sky, where stars had begun to appear faintly between the city's lights. He felt a deep sense of contentment, the kind that came rarely but stayed with you long after. Turning to the others, he said, "Next weekend. Same time, same place." The agreement was immediate, a chorus of voices sealing the plan. They began to drift off in pairs and small groups, heading towards subway stations or side streets that led back to their homes. The laughter lingered even as they separated, echoing faintly until it was swallowed by the hum of the city. Arthur walked alone for a few blocks, his glove still hanging from his hand. He could feel the ache in his knees, the heaviness in his shoulders, but it didn't bother him. Every step was lightened by the memory of the ball sailing over the fence, of Marcus's catch, of Eli's leap. He knew these were the kinds of days that lived on in stories, the kind that would be retold on cold winter nights or at reunions years later. As he turned onto his street, a smile crept across his face. Summer was far from over, and already he knew that this season would leave behind more than just sweat and sunburns. It would leave behind a memory of a summer baseball game in Brooklyn that no one forgot, a game that tied together not just innings and scores, but friendships, laughter, and the sheer magic of being alive in that moment. And though the night was quiet now, the story of that game was only beginning to grow. The night after the game stretched into silence, yet the energy of the day refused to fade. In every corner of Brooklyn where the players lived, fragments of the afternoon replayed themselves like reels of film in their minds. Some dreamed of catches and swings. Others simply fell asleep with the sounds of cheering echoing faintly in their ears. For Arthur, the memory lingered like a soft warmth. He sat at his kitchen table long after he returned home, a glass of water at his side, staring out of the window toward the darkened street. He was tired, his body sore, but his thoughts carried him back to the moment when the ball cracked off his bat and soared into the golden sky. Across town, Sean was restless. He paced his small apartment, laughing aloud as he reenacted his missed swings in front of the mirror. He wasn't disappointed. If anything, he was energized, replaying Peter's dramatic catch over and over in his head. He texted almost everyone from the group before he finally collapsed into bed, his phone buzzing with replies and jokes. Clara tucked Marcus in, listening to him chatter excitedly about his single and his miraculous catch. His eyes sparkled even as sleep pulled at him, and she felt proud, not only of his bravery, but of how the group had welcomed him so easily. She knew he would carry that joy with him into the next game, into the next week, maybe even into the next summer. The city outside was its usual self. Taxis rushed through the avenues, late-night shops spilled light onto the sidewalks, and the air carried both the hum of neon signs and the scent of fried food. Yet within the hearts of those who had played, the rhythm of the game still beat strong. By Monday morning, life resumed its ordinary shape. The sun rose over the brownstones, commuters spilled into subway stations, and the clatter of the city returned to its usual volume. But at coffee breaks, over shared lunches, and during quiet commutes, pieces of Saturday's game returned. Henry told his co-workers about a surprising hit, modestly leaving out the cheer that had followed it. Eli described his catch so animatedly to a classmate that the boy demanded to join the next weekend's game. The story of the match began to spread in small circles. Neighbors who had passed by the park spoke of the roar that had gone up when Arthur hit his home run, or when Marcus clutched the ball in his small glove. A father told his son about the final catch, describing it like something out of a movie. In this way, the game began to grow larger than itself, weaving into the neighborhood's fabric. By the middle of the week, plans were already forming for the next Saturday. Messages buzzed back and forth, players suggesting lineups, teasing one another about past mistakes, and promising bigger moments to come. Sean vowed loudly that he would not leave the field without hitting the ball into the trees. Clara insisted Marcus would get another at-bat no matter what. Even the quieter ones, like Henry, felt anticipation humming under their skin. The week passed, and when Saturday arrived again, the park was ready. The field looked the same as before, chalk lines bright and grass neatly trimmed. Yet there was a sense that it held something more now. The players arrived earlier, carrying with them not only their gear, but also the weight of expectation. Word had spread enough that more people came to watch, settling on blankets along the edges of the field, bringing coolers filled with drinks, and cheering with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for bigger stages. Arthur noticed a difference as soon as he stepped onto the dirt. The air felt thicker, buzzing with voices and laughter. He tightened his glove, stretching slowly as if preparing not just for a game, but for another moment that might etch itself into memory. The first innings unfolded with familiar joy. The crack of the bat, the slap of ball into glove, the shouts of encouragement all filled the warm afternoon air. Yet this time, the players carried with them the weight of last week's glory. Every play seemed a little sharper, every sprint a little faster, every cheer a little louder. Marcus once again stole the spotlight, hitting a line drive that startled even him, then running the bases with a grin so wide it seemed to pull everyone with it. Clara, steady as ever, made 2 catches that drew applause from the crowd. Sean, true to his word, swung with such force that the ball disappeared into branches of a nearby tree, stuck among the leaves until a boy climbed up later to retrieve it. The day stretched long, the innings unfolding like chapters in a story. Each player had their moment. Peter with a throw that cut down a runner at home, Paul with a double that sent 2 teammates sprinting across the plate, Henry with a bunt so perfectly placed that even the opposing team clapped. Eli, once again on the mound, pitched with fire that made every batter respect him more. By the time the sun began to lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, the game had once again become something more than just a pastime. It was alive with the spirit of the players, with the laughter of the crowd, with the bonds that stretched invisibly among them all. The field seemed to breathe with their energy, holding it close as though reluctant to let go. When the final inning ended, the score hardly mattered. What mattered was the way the players collapsed onto the grass together, their breaths ragged, their faces lit by smiles. Children rushed onto the field to mimic their heroes, swinging imaginary bats and diving for invisible balls. The crowd lingered, clapping and chatting, reluctant to break the spell. That night, the diner was even more crowded. Tables pushed together, voices raised, plates clattering, the sound of joy filling the room. Marcus fell asleep against Clara's shoulder before dessert even arrived, his small hand still curled around his glove. Arthur sat at the end of the table, watching the group with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that what they had started had already grown into something bigger than themselves. And so it continued. Week after week, through the rest of the summer, they returned to the field. Each game added new stories, new moments to be told and retold. They laughed until their stomachs hurt, argued over plays, clapped one another on the back, and ran until their legs burned. They became part of something larger, something that reached beyond the boundaries of the park. Even as the season began to wane, as leaves hinted at the approach of autumn, the games remained. They played under cooler skies, their breaths sometimes visible in the air, but the spirit was unchanged. And long after the last game of the season ended, the memories lingered. The crack of Arthur's home run, the leap of Eli's catch, the pride in Marcus's eyes. It was more than just baseball. It was the sound of summer in Brooklyn, the feeling of belonging, the joy of knowing that in those golden afternoons they had touched something timeless. As the last shadows of the evening settled over Brooklyn, the small park where the game had taken place seemed almost transformed. The laughter, the shouting, the sound of the bat meeting the ball, all had quieted into memory. The makeshift diamond still held the faint scuff marks of running shoes, and the benches still carried the warmth of those who had sat for hours cheering and talking. Yet now it was calm, as if the city itself wanted to hold on to what had happened, reluctant to let it fade too quickly. Daniel lingered by the fence, his hands resting on the cool metal wire, looking out at the field where so much had unfolded. He could still hear the rhythm of the afternoon in his head, a blend of sport and fellowship, of tension and release, of triumph and forgiveness. James joined him quietly, a bottle of water in hand, offering one without words. For a moment they just stood side by side, the city lights beginning to flicker to life around them, casting a warm glow that softened the edges of the day. "This one's going to stay with us," James finally said, his voice steady but tinged with awe. Daniel nodded. "Not just us. Everyone here will remember it. The way it felt, it was more than a game." Around them, people were slowly dispersing. Families carried tired children home, still chattering about the double play in the 7th inning. Teenagers walked in small groups, replaying their favorite moments as if retelling them might make them last longer. Even strangers who had only stumbled upon the game now left with a sense that they had been part of something rare, something they hadn't expected when they woke up that morning in Brooklyn. As the players packed up, their laughter came softer now, less boisterous but deeper, shaped by gratitude and shared experience. Ethan shook hands with nearly everyone, his face bright with the pride of having played his part. Michael's smile returned, free of the weight it had carried earlier, his eyes alive with the spirit of belonging. Rachel tucked her notebook under her arm, but her gaze lingered on the field, knowing she would capture not just the plays but the atmosphere, the way a community had come alive under the sun. By the time the last bag was slung over his shoulder and the final car door closed, the park seemed to exhale. It had been witness to more than a neighborhood gathering. It had held the weight of memory being written in real time. Brooklyn itself seemed to hum with it, the streets buzzing with life that carried echoes of the cheers, as though the borough refused to let the day vanish unnoticed. For those who had been there, it would remain a story passed on to others, at dinner tables, in late-night conversations, in the quiet nostalgia of a walk to the park years later. A summer baseball game in Brooklyn that no one forgot, not because of a final score or a single heroic act, but because of the way it drew people together, stitching strangers and friends into a shared moment of joy, tension, and release. And so, under the gathering night, Brooklyn held its breath, keeping safe a memory of a game that would outlive the season, the year, perhaps even the generation. It was, in the end, a reminder that sometimes the simplest events, on a hot afternoon, with nothing more than a ball, a bat, and an open field, could become timeless.